Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Bulletproof Selling. Now, in this live stream, you get to talk to me, the Chief Sales Architect of Bulletproof Selling. I'm Sean Rhodes, and here we believe that hope is not a sales strategy. So we are here to increase the performance of salespeople, their pipelines, and the results of their teams. So in this Bulletproof Selling series, if you've gotten to catch us before, we're sharing insights from the top minds in sales, best-selling authors, trainers, those that are actually out there teaching people how to sell better. But we often get the opportunity, as we do today, to invite somebody from the front line of sales, somebody who's actually managing those salespeople, responsible for making number every month and every quarter, to be able to share kind of what's going on in their industry on the front line of sales to actually build pipeline, implement better systems, and make sure that we're getting consistently better results. So my commitment is that of every single one of these episodes, we actually get to build a sales system with the person that we're going to be having here on the interview. So you get to use that no matter the size of your team or the size of your goals. So with that, it is my pleasure to welcome into the show Mr. Doug Billings. Doug, welcome to the show, sir. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. If you would mind, sir, tell us a little bit about yourself, because I've gotten to meet you, but maybe not everybody watching has. So who are you? How long have you been in sales? Tell us a little bit about you.
I've been in sales for, I can't even count how many years. I'm getting too old now. I started in retail sales, and then I've worked into out of that industry, and then went into the different form of selling, which is working with manufacturers, reps, selling to business. I've been doing that for 19 years now in the print industry. So I currently reside in the role of Vice President of Sales and Marketing for Empire Screen Printing, which is located in beautiful La Crosse, Wisconsin.
And just give people an idea about kind of where you sit in that organization and how large they are, because we often get to have people on the show that are supervising 2 salespeople, and then we have people that are supervising, hundreds of them. So tell us a little bit about the team that you have under you, and what the changes they've seen maybe in the last year. Because I know in your industry, it wasn't always largely digital, and it's kind of moving in that direction. So tell us a little bit about the team that you have.
So currently I have about 42 outside manufacturers reps that are working around the United States and into the top part of Mexico. I also have a group of 2 telemarketers and also one inside salesperson. We primarily as a company use manufacturers reps. They've worked the best for us, have that industry knowledge, and carry all those product lines that have that synergy that goes along with what our product is. What I've been seeing as of late, though, with manufacturers reps is that they're used to being in the offices, out in the field, talking to people, that interaction that all of us salespeople are used to, having those face-to-face meetings. And of course, with the pandemic, they've been trying to do Zoom calls, and some of the older ones, that's been an issue, learning technology because they're not familiar with it.
Yeah, and then for the kind of intro that you heard, and of course you're familiar with us and what we do here at Bulletproof Selling, we firmly believe that hope is not a sales strategy. So when you're 19 years, you've gotten to see hope in play a lot. And it often doesn't give us the results that we're after, especially in sales. So where do you see salespeople right now relying on hope a little more than they should?
Oh, that's quite the question. You put a lot into a few sentences.
I know. It's Barbara Walters here.
Yeah, I think right now there's a lot of hope that we're just going to go back to normal, I guess, is where the hope is lying. I think we're starting to see a little bit of that. Actually, companies are being a little bit more open, especially in the states that are what we'd consider opening up, meetings still with requirements of masks and things like that. But they really are hoping that things are going to be the way they were. And, there's this debate back and forth right now is, are we in the Zoom world and that's what it's going to be? And people are all at home working, or is it going to go back to normal? And, where I'm from and dealing with so many people around the United States, I see a lot more people thinking and hoping that it's going to go back to the way it was, with a little bit of their time, part of the Zoom calls, because it is convenient. But people are getting, tired of the Zoom. They're getting the tired of the screens and being in front of them all the time. I mean, we usually are anyway. So that's the hope that I think people are seeing right now.
So hoping that they're going to get back to the way things were. And I know in a lot of industries, especially inside of the government, they're realizing the cost savings of not having to have people out on the road. And we've all had to learn. It'd be different if we just kind of requested you do less in-person meetings, but try to keep making number. In 2020, it was no in-person meetings. We don't have an option about it, yet we're still held to the same goals, even if they're modified in different ways. So in your viewpoint then, do you feel like there is going to be a return to normal? Is it going to be a new normal that we step into? What do you see the future looking like in the next year for these salespeople?
I think there's going to be some of the past coming back, and we'll get into what we consider normal. But I do think that you're going to see that the Zoom calls, team meetings, all of the different versions there are, that's going to continue on, because it does make sense. I mean, you can do a lot via the Zoom call, but then there's sometimes when you have to put product in front of the customer, you need to be there, talk it through. And that's why I say I think it's going to be kind of not as much of the face-to-face, but it's still going to be a large part of what we do. I will give an example. I'm seeing we hold an expo, and we're just getting inundated by people who want to be in the expo right now because they want to get back to what they were doing. So it's hard to get that out of people. I think the younger ones kind of like this more. The older ones, they want to get back to what it used to be. Yeah. So it's going to be kind of a mix.
And that's the kind of life they've known. But as you've seen in 19 years, sales has changed in some ways, and it hasn't changed in others. It's always been about providing value and building a trusted relationship. But the technology that we have available now didn't exist 19 years ago. A lot of it didn't. And so I'd like to hear from you a little bit about, and this is going to be another great question, right? Like, get ready to put your thinking hat on. In 10 words or less, what do you see separates great salespeople today from the ones that are still kind of clinging to the past?
Those who embrace technology and build their personal brand.
That was actually under 10 words. I love it. That was great, man. Okay, so let's talk about the first piece, which is embracing technology. And technology, if you really go to Merriam-Webster's dictionary and look at the definition, it doesn't necessarily mean $100,000 a month CRM that's enterprise-wide. Technology is just leveraging tools that you might have available. And so I'd love to hear from you. What are the most basic things that you see kind of connotate success in your company? So if I'm coming to you and I say, Doug, I'm really interested in working for you, what are the basic skill sets that I have to have in order to leverage technology? Is it, taking good notes during a meeting? Is it, entering them into a CRM? Is it tracking people through a pipeline? What are the really basic elements you see great salespeople using?
I think capturing the information in a CRM, and it doesn't matter which CRM, there's a lot of good choices out there. There's actually some inexpensive or free choices out there that are really good now. Mm-hmm. I think putting the notes in and having that to reference back. I hear a lot of, I'm just too busy, and it seems to be that, I'm doing up double work or this, but keeping those notes is a great reference. I mean, every conversation I have with a customer, it's going in the CRM. I can reference back. I know where I'm at because we are so inundated by technology, the Zoom calls, the meetings, all the things that go on. That's the only way you're going to keep yourself together and organized and able to go back. We can't remember all the things that we can remember. So I think a good CRM is a good starting place for people. But then also just knowing, like if you take the Zoom calls, I see a lot of people who you're watching the video and it's just horrible video and they're relying on an old computer, or you can go out and get a really good camera and really take your presentation game up to another level. So it doesn't look like you're looking through a fog or a haze. And I see that all the time on these Zoom calls. So, and like I said, cameras are so inexpensive, under $100, you can get yourself a really nice camera with a light. You can go to any big box retailer. And that's another thing I think that people should be adding to their repertoire, especially if we're going to be in this era of Zoom calls.
Absolutely. The first thing you mentioned, let's touch on that for a second, because the teams that I was able to study around the world, these high-performing teams in the military, the ones who ended up being bulletproof, not because of superpowers, but because they did take the time to download information. So after every mission, they would take the time to sit down and go over their notes, so to speak. Here are the things we encountered. Here's what we expected to encounter. Here are the things we didn't expect that we definitely need to make note of, because maybe that was a close call, or unfortunately somebody got hurt. We want to prevent that from happening again. In the sales world, it can be the same type of process. So if you're coaching a junior salespeople through the type of notes they should be kind of capturing at the tail end, they might have 4 pages of random notes. How do I decide what's really valuable enough to actually capture as a CRM note so that I can reference it at my next contact point with that prospect?
Well, it's funny you reference the military, and I know that's a lot of what the bulletproof selling principle is. But I just happened to be reading my grandfather's log. He actually did what you said, is putting all the notes down. What were the key things to the mission when he was a bomber pilot? And so it's really interesting to kind of take that and look at how do you do that in the sales. And I was studying it after reading some of your material. But to your question, I think if you really look at in the notes, what's going to advance the sale? If it's not going to advance the sale, or it's going to help give you a reminder point of how do I satisfy a need or match it up, then I don't think it's worth putting in there. I mean, you can't put every single, hey, how's the weather into your notes. It's got to be anything that's going to advance that sale or help give you a reminder of this customer said they have this need, and so how do I match my product up to satisfy that need? And so if you follow that, that's probably the easiest way to do that. Or if it's key information that has to do with how you're quoting it, a note that needs to be a reminder to you that this is something to bring up with the customer. So those are how I approach it and what the key notes are that I put in a CRM.
I love it. And for a lot of people, that could be a lot of different things, right? Because obviously we got people from across industry watching the show, listening to the podcast. So something that we found extremely helpful in the clients we've gotten to work with is helping them define what are those key elements that you need to make sure that you capture. And there might be dozens of them over the course of the life cycle of a prospect in order to make them to be a customer, right? When you can't capture dozens of things inside of a 20-minute meeting or a 15-minute, extemporaneous phone call. I happen to get them on the phone right now. And so for defining those things ahead of time, do you recommend that salespeople do that inside of something like a checklist? Should it be, a function or feature inside of their CRM if they're taking notes and they're on the phone like your telemarketers might be doing? How do I really, make sure that the stuff I do need to ask is defined somewhere so that at the end of a great conversation, and I've done this before, I've been guilty of it. I realize, wow, I should have asked like 8 things and I totally forgot just because they weren't in front of me. And now I've got to wait till the next contact point to qualify for budget or find out about their buying window or all these things, right? So how do you recommend your salespeople go about capturing those types of important items ahead of time so that they're ready when they're in conversation?
Well, in the print industry, one of the tools that we developed for our telemarketing was we call it the label need sheet. So they have a sheet. It's also computerized too. Our IT department made it so they can have it on the screen, but they can just go right down a checklist and make sure that they don't miss the key information if it's the items they need to ask for quoting. Their CRM is, and I won't mention names because I'm not selling CRMs here, but the CRM we have is actually, we can modify the screen so each person's screen looks similar, but if I went on to one of the telemarketers' screens, she may have, for example, different key points that she has on the side that she records versus what I put in. I like to have a few key elements from the initial conversation about the person. So let's say they enjoyed fishing, golfing, and had 3 kids. I like to have those 3 things in front of me so I can reference back at the beginning, because the way I was brought up is, and especially with relationship selling, you are the most important, that connection between you and that person you're selling to first and foremost. So you have to have that relationship, those elements that when you're talking to people, talk about that and then get into the business. And then I also have a checklist based on a selling prints or a selling class where it's the key questions to be asking. So here are the needs questions, here are the how to evaluate whether the person is the decision maker, and so on. And it's in one page, hangs on a bulletin board above the telemarketing salespeople as well.
So you
always have that in front of you.
Yep. Yeah. Yep. And now something that I think would be extremely valuable, because a lot of organizations have that type of thing built. The problem, though, and this is something that we see a lot in systems, is that it might not have been updated since 2018. Well, it worked in 2018. It might have worked pretty well in 2019. We're seeing less and less results with it in 2020. Now we're in this brand new year of 2021, and the things that I should have been asking back then might be modified now. Or a lot of these organizations, maybe they've just kind of fractaled out how they purchase. So it's not just one decision maker now. Now it's a committee. Well, what do I do with that? I only know how to ask about a singular decision maker. And so to really break this down for a salesperson, with the idea being, and anything about systems, and you know this as well as anybody, Doug, the idea in systems is not to make everybody march in lockstep or to be an automaton or a robot. It's that I have a basis foundation to operate from so that I can be more present, so that I can be a better relationship salesperson. Because if I'm focusing on the 18 things I'm supposed to get out of this conversation, I probably am not going to be focusing on, really being in the moment with this person and paying attention to those social cues, the eye contact if it's a Zoom call. So I'd love to know for you, how do you go about updating that type of a sheet for your people? Because you mentioned a physical copy on a bulletin board. Is something that you make sure your folks, take a look at every year, every quarter? How does that thing get changed?
So for the label needs example, that's pretty standard. I mean, that's not a lot. It's going to change once in a while. Some things do. So we modify that as we go along, as equipment changes and how that affects that sheet. But again, that comes down to the same stuff. From the standpoint of questions asking, is really looking at questions and sharing what are questions that are being asked right now, what are things that are coming up. So we look at it probably, every quarter or so. But that's just even within just regular discussions of talking between salespeople and saying, hey, this is something that's come up as a question we should ask. The telemarketers, for example, that we have, they have a book of just questions. I mean, to keep things fresh. I mean, it can get pretty stagnant if you keep asking the same questions, especially relationship to questions. So what are some new things you can ask? The hard part with telemarketing is you don't want telemarketers to sound like telemarketers. You want them to actually sound like human beings who, it's not, I go down the script, which I hate when you get called and they're on a script. So that's why keeping books, like there's books like 250 questions to ask in the sales process, things like that. And they can reference that sits in their library that we build for them, that they can go and kind of freshen that up when they think that they need to add some new things. So they don't get stuck in a rut, because that's really what can happen. It can be, like you're saying, it just gets repetitive, and is it the right things to be asking right now? Those things change. So that's kind of how we handle that and tackle that. Yeah.
Yeah, I love it, man. So this actually sounds like something that would be extremely valuable, because it actually could be applied at any point along a sales process. From they don't know me and I don't know them, so we're almost cold at that point. I might have enough research to know they're a viable prospect, but that's about it. All the way to we've been in contact for 18 months. I've gotten a couple of quotes out to them. Now they're finally ready to buy. So it could really apply anywhere. And I think the sales system that would be really valuable for you and I to build together, for anybody to be able to use, is this idea of how do I make those informal conversations between salespeople in the hallway or on Skype or on any kind of chat platform now, if you're still virtual with your team, how do I make those lift out of kind of that social context and become more a part of our process? Because if you have two salespeople that share the idea that, hey, I asked this one question and wow, it opened up this entire vertical in the company that I didn't even know existed, and the other salesperson hears that and thinks that's great. Well, now you got two salespeople using it, but you really want all of your salespeople using it if it could apply to them. So let's talk about how to begin to kind of pull those out of casual conversations and begin capturing them. So as we talk about systems in the military, I know your dad was a firm believer in this, and probably your grandpa, if he served, and anybody in your family. I know in mine it happened this way. To build something like this, we have to have a trigger event, because we're going to talk about trimming. So it's TRIM, trimming hope away from our strategy. So we talk about that trigger event. In your mind, what would be a good time period to visit the questions that you're asking your prospects? Because some salespeople are using a really formal script, like your telemarketers. Some of them might have something that's been buried in a binder for a couple of months or years or decades in some cases. So how often should I be taking a look at my questions and asking myself, hey, are these really relevant? And especially today, is that monthly, quarterly, annually, biannually? What does that look like for you?
Pretty much every time I go if I go out with on a sales call with a manufacturer rep, or listening to what the telemarketers do. Yeah, pretty much all the time. I mean, things change so rapidly, from day to day that I don't know if I'd put a quarterly. I think it's a continuously flowing change. And then when you have your meetings with the sales force, is to get out and say, hey, this is what's working with so-and-so and this person. I'm blessed because we have a group that really interacts well. They've known each other for many, many years. They share things. When we have a rep call, for example, they're the first ones who'll say, hey, this is working here, or this market is hot, and share all that information. So in that regards, I have it pretty easy. But like I said, every time you go on a call, you should be listening and trying different things, actually. I like to mix it up. I don't like to be the same every single time I go out and go do a sales call. I like to change it. It has to change, because not every person who's going to buy from you is going to be the same. They're all different. Right. Everybody's unique. So your approach should be very fluid. Years ago, I was always told, go in, pretty much, here's how this meeting's going to go. And today, I don't even think about what I'm going to do when I go in there. I just let it flow and work as it goes. Because, even if you have a conversation, that conversation could glean a lot of information. If you're prepared and you got to stay on track of this script you wrote for yourself,
right?
It's going to be so rigid, and you won't glean out some information that maybe you could have. And that's kind of how I've approached it.
Yeah, and I would be willing to bet it's because you've made a lot of mistakes along the way in your conversations.
Oh, sure.
That's accurate. Yeah, the most experienced, that's where it comes from. I dorked this up 5 years ago and lost the sale, and I know not to do that again.
And that's why it's so important to go back and sit down after your call and do a breakdown of what took place, whether it be a Zoom call, in person, because that's where you can go back and learn from your mistakes. I think that's one of the issues that a lot of salespeople have is they think, well, this sounded really good. It looks promising. And then they don't think there's anything they need to go. But I know when I've said something that didn't make sense, or I should do this. And so when you go through your briefing at the end and write down some things, that's how you can learn. I always say you learn from your mistakes, but a lot of people don't like to learn from their mistakes. They just think everything was great. So,
right. Yeah. But that's the fallacy we have. So if we've got exactly. So if we have the trigger, and I love the fact you didn't make it weekly. You're like, hey, every call. I mean, take the time to debrief every call and figure out, did I ask something that I really should be asking more often? Maybe it's not appropriate in every call, and it's part of like a lockstep script that I use, but hey, that was a powerful question, and it just came out of my mouth, which happens all the time. We always innovate things. It happens with every person. That's kind of what makes us unique as people. So I've got the trigger. Every single sales meeting that I have, I really should be taking the time to ask, did anything unique come out of that I need to capture that might be useful in the future? The second part of this acronym TRIM is the R, which means making it repeatable. And so I might take the time, as you mentioned, to, after my next sales call, try to practice this, capture one question, but 3 or 4 sales calls later, I realize, I didn't even follow that process I just built. I haven't been capturing. I've just been going one call to the next, to the next, to the next. So how do you advise that salespeople make this repeatable? Does it look like a really simple checklist or a sheet of paper they keep in front of them for capturing this kind of stuff? How do I make sure I'm taking the time to really capture, hey, that was a beautiful question. I need to ask that again.
Some of the best sales programs that I've seen, read, or gone through have a checklist at the end, and it's usually just a very small note card size and it has a few questions, about 4 or 5 questions. And that's where you track that information. Because, if you're doing a whole survey on yourself, you're never going to do it.
Right.
It has to be, just like setting goals, they need to be, achievable. To make it achievable, it's got to be short and to the point. I got 4 questions and I fill this out and start to make it a habit. Of course, it takes 30 days to become a habit, so you got to get into that routine of doing it. But I think if you make it short and simple, it's the most effective. If you make it too much for yourself, you should be realistic. You're never going to do it. Right. And that's kind of what I've seen with some of the best programs that I think are out there. That's one of the things that's the key to what they do at the end.
And I think critical, you mentioned this, is getting it out of your head, because I can always, try to remember it in the future. But as 19 years later, the things that you've remembered have now become natural process for you. You don't have to think about it. I know here's what I need to achieve in this call. And if it goes this way, I know what to do. And if this objection comes up, I know how to overcome that or turn it around. But for a junior salespeople, or maybe even somebody 10 years into their career, they might not have seen that enough to be able to know exactly what needs to happen. So getting it out of your head onto something that not only you can see, but that can be shared. And this is where the next thing is going to come in, where make this improvable. So TRI, this is the improvable part of this system that we're building together. So if we're going to make this thing improvable, and it really comes down to 2 elements in my mind. One are the questions that I'm asking myself. So if I have a list of 4 questions, how often am I updating those questions? Because they might have worked in 1955 when Dale Carnegie wrote them down, but maybe they're not so relevant now in 2021. Or, and this is the second piece of this, actually making sure that what I write down, my responses, I made sure to ask about this person's kids, and wow, that opened up a whole new window into their lives, and it was really helpful now. I should ask about everybody's family from now on. So, the answer that kind of came out of that. So how do we, 1, control the questions that we ask, to update the 4 or 5 questions every once in a while, and then 2, to make it improvable in, actually making sure that we capture this stuff? How do you make sure that your salespeople would do that if this is a system that you'd ask them to use?
Well, I guess, some of what we're talking about here is I don't like to get too much into steering them. I think it's being more generic with what they're comfortable with. Of picking questions. And again, I referenced there's so many good books out there. Your book, for example, others, to take on continuously being learning. So I'm also a teacher. So I always say knowledge is power, power is everything. The more knowledge you can gain, which is why some of the best minds in the world read constantly. So find the books that if it's questions where your focus area is going to be, then find those books, read them, and just continuously kind of refresh of, hey, that's a good question, and I should ask this, and then also taking those notes at the end of your sales call of this worked really well. Don't get rigid, and so that's where I would go and continuously trying to gain knowledge from different resources. Also, talking to salespeople outside of your own industry is helpful, or even within your industry. If you're in an industry like ours, which happens to a lot of information is shared of how they're going about and the struggles they have from a sales standpoint. But getting outside in other industries and seeing how they're approaching it is very helpful when coming up with the right questions that can help you. Again, it's got to be more personal. Selling is so personal, and especially relationship selling. It's that back and forth and not being too rigid, because you don't want to sound like you're the shifty salesperson or
Right.
telesalesperson. You want to sound human and make that connection with them. And so, I think you can have a few trigger questions that you start with and then change them as you go along and try to. But I always say try different things all the time. You never know what's gonna hit. So.
And something you mentioned
fully
really
answered
powerful.
the question, but
No, you absolutely did. So, I'm looking at my bookshelf now. You can't see it on the screen, but I've got two massive bookshelves full of sales and leadership material. And the reason that I love that stuff so much is that in the early days when I started consuming this type of professional development, I'd come across a couple of good ideas in every book and then hope I remember to use them. But if I have a 4 or 5 part, little checklist that I'm supposed to be writing down stuff to kind of, like prompting questions, if you will, after every sales call, or maybe even not every sales call, but maybe the ones where I actually issue a proposal or I get a quote out, right? Maybe there's some kind of delineating factor, because if I'm making 100 calls a day, I really don't want to answer 5 questions on every single one of them. But if 20 of those go to quote, I'm willing to answer 5 questions on those if it gets me more, the next week. So with all these books that I have, it's the ability to pull a question out and say, wow, that's a powerful question. I need to be asking that, and allow that to maybe affect one of my 4 or 5, kind of debrief questions out of these sales meetings. So it's not just the ability to read, which is great, but it's the ability to apply. And so, I'd say part 3 of your, knowledge is power and power is everything. I've often heard it said applied power is even better. If I can't apply it, then it's just power held. A weightlifter is great, but lifting those 800 pounds off the floor, that's when it really gets powerful. So if we've got the trigger, we've got making it repeatable, we've got making it improvable, which I love, always be reading. That's a great thing. Better than always be closing is always be reading. The last part of this is to make it measurable. So if I'm a leader like you are, and I'm asking my salespeople to, kind of answer a couple of questions after sales meetings that are of a certain level, or if they only have a couple of them a day, then maybe after every sales meeting, how do I make sure that my people are actually using this? And how do I make sure that it's actually leading to the results that I want them to lead to?
Well, I think unfortunately, the way to do is it needs to be entered in, or that when you, after that call, is put the notes in a CRM. In referencing back to the beginning of our conversation, is if you have 4 key questions that you're going to ask, then put the answers in a CRM so they can be tracked. That's one way, or jot them down. I mean, that's kind of, we're getting to the point where you don't have to write anymore. So just type them out, whatever. I mean, and the whole thing about, well, I don't have time. Everybody's got 5 minutes quick after a call to just jot something down, put those notes in your phone. One thing I'm notorious for is I text myself all the time with what I had from a meeting, if there's key notes that I need to do, so I don't forget them. It's just something you need to make a habit. Again, keeps coming back to that whole habit thing. Is just do it, and put those notes in, and then go back. And then when you leave that call, you should have also had, what was your objective for the next time you talk to that person? If you want a good question that's on there, that's one that should be on there. Is what, and you should know that before you start, is what is my objective from this meeting? Is it going to get a quote? Is it going to get a blueprint? Are we going to have another meeting? I think that's one of the questions and key parts that people, especially new salespeople, miss, is to have an objective of when they're going in. Because if you don't have any objective, why are you having a meeting?
Right, why are you having a call?
Yeah, absolutely. But I see that all the time. I give a story about, I was with a salesman one time, and we pull into this place, and it's towards the end of the day, and he goes, we're going to go in here. And I said, so who are we meeting with? He goes, well, I don't have anybody that we're meeting with. I'm just going to drop off literature. And I said, well, so what's the objective of this call? And he didn't have one. I said, well, I'm not getting out. And he's like looking at me like, you're crazy. And I didn't get out. I'm like, this is a complete waste of time. You don't even know what literature to leave the person because you never did any homework on that. So again, always having that objective is important.
Oh yeah, so having the objective of not only, and I love the fact I need to walk in there with an objective. We call those micro objectives, and we devoted a whole chapter to them in Bulletproof Selling. So I know that you're probably familiar with that by now. And then the other side to that I love is maybe the other follow-up question on the tail end of all of these is, hey, what is my next step with this? Where's it going from here?
You have to know what you're going to do next with it. And you have to know that before you get into the call. I mean, because that's how you can direct the call. So it's just not, you went in there and you talked about the weather for 40 minutes and you're left with nothing. And there are people that you can sell to that they would talk about the weather or their kids or whatever for 40 minutes and go, well, my time's up. I got to get to the next meeting. And it's like, we didn't accomplish anything. So it's maximizing your time so it's effective. And that's one of the ways is have that objective before you go in.
Well, this is a beautiful system, Doug. Thanks for building it with us. And you've developed quite a personal brand on your own. Not only, are you a sales leader, you're a teacher, you're a photographer, you got your hands on a whole lot of pies. If people want to know more about you and kind of the great work you're doing out there in the world, how do they find out more? How do they connect with you?
I'm on LinkedIn. I'm a big proponent of LinkedIn, have been since the very start. I think it's a great way in business to build your personal brand. And right now, I think if we're going to be in this virtual world, your personal brand had better be stunning. So I always preach the LinkedIn to all people, but that's where you can find me. I accept all invitations that people send me to talk and learn more about them. It's great. And even if it's not somebody I'm trying to sell to, it's learning other industries and keeping up what's going on with business as a whole is fantastic. So.
Love it. Yeah, but make sure you do connect with Doug. He is very receptive on LinkedIn. I'll be the first one to testify to that. It was great to connect with you. So for all of those that are interested in getting deeper into the world of bulletproof selling, make sure you're following us on LinkedIn. We're definitely out there on YouTube for these live streams, and of course the podcast that we have that appears on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, anywhere podcasts can be found. And of course, for more sales systems to help you replace hope with certainty, make sure you're checking out the free resources that we're releasing every single day of the work week at bulletproof-selling.com. Sean Rhodes here. It's been a pleasure serving you alongside Doug Billings today. Doug, let's go out there and make selling bulletproof.
Thanks, Sean.